Welcome to the interview with Amnesty International representative Dirk Pleiter. We are going to have an interview on Amnesty International work with special focus on People's Republic of China. And I thank you very much for coming first. Saving some time for crucial questions regarding cultural diplomacy. And so I'm immediately going to start with the question I have. What does cultural diplomacy mean for Amnesty International in consideration of your working experience in this field?
Well, cultural diplomacy has, of course, an important role for the communication of the concept of human rights. And I mean, if we look back in, say, the recent decades in the discussion about human rights in China, there had been a lot of prejudices and also a lot of misunderstandings. Say, for some extent on purpose, because of following political agendas, but also because there are different approaches then to the human rights. But at the same time, of course, we have to be careful in not to dilute our agenda if you talk about human rights, in the sense that using cultural arguments to move away from the concept of universal human rights. But of course, we have to consider the human rights on the background of the individual cultures. This is not only important, to understand better where there are conflicts between different human rights. There are conflicts. Just take an example as we currently being here in Germany, the freedom of speech is limited in Germany as far as discussion about the Holocaust is concerned and as far as the denial of the Holocaust is concerned. So that is a typical example of where you have cultural limits to certain human rights. The other area where it's very important is if you start to think about how can I prevent human rights violations to happen. Also there are many cultural factors involved there, and that's where cultural diplomacy also helps.
So to be very specific, could you give a description or definition of cultural diplomacy for the work of Amnesty International?
Well, it's difficult to give, say, a formal definition of cultural diplomacy. I think it's more kind of, say, a technique in order to promote human rights, to also have an exchange on the cultural background of human rights, on the cultural background of the political system, to also give better understanding of why did one came up, say, in a long path of history with this concept of human rights, which is not completely unknown in China, as it is sometimes argued. But say one step which was eventually not done in China was to have a formal definition of the human rights. And that, of course, is, for instance, also a difference. And by looking at the cultural difference, that helps to get a better understanding why is that and what is needed, to arrive at a point where we have a better protection of human rights.
Staying with the point of the case of China, the debate on human rights and defending or execution of human rights has raised many debates in the recent time, particularly looking at the Arab Spring and the involvement of European countries to defending human rights in Libya against the Gaddafi regime. I would like to know, in consideration of the China bashing debates in the United States, but also in Germany, the threat of the upcoming Red Force in the East. In as much, can you tell us something about the strategy of China in Africa? Would you say we can speak about a cultural diplomacy approach in Africa for China to get a stone in the bridge?
I don't think so. I think the policy of China in Africa is a rather pragmatic approach, which is strongly driven by economical interests, mainly by the interest of having access to the resources which are needed in China itself, to keep economical growth going. And that is of crucial importance for the leadership in this country because it doesn't have democratic legitimation. So it's the main reason why the current government is widely accepted in China is that it is seen as a guarantee of the unity of the country. And it is seen as a guarantee for the ongoing economical reform and the economical growth. And that's why the Chinese leadership has to do all steps which are needed in order to ensure that also in future, I mean, one has a significant growth of economy in China. Otherwise, the current leadership would be put into question.
Okay, since obviously my background was sociology, I would like to hand over now to a professor from Romania whose focus is rather in history to pose more critical questions that we learn a little more about the activity of Amnesty International regarding cultural diplomacy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kaufmann. Actually, my name is Ovidiu Pecican. I belong to the University of Babeș-Bolyai from Cluj-Napoca, Romania. That means, namely, the western part of Romania, Transylvania, the land of vampires, as you know, perhaps. So I have a vampire question for our guest here, and it's about this specific case of the brilliant writer Mo Yan, Nobel Prize for last year. So Mo Yan is seen more like very close to the official regime in China. So do you think by receiving the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Foundation gives support to your organization, or on the contrary?
Well, I don't think it would be, say, a good idea, I mean, to make the Nobel Prize for Literature completely depend on the question of human rights. I mean, of course, one can have a critical view on the role of this writer and, for instance, also his position as far as censorship is concerned. I mean, he had also, before he received this prize, and also after he received this prize, he has, say, defended censorship. And certainly, I mean, there we have different opinions on that. But on the other hand, I mean, I'm not an expert on literature, so I mean, for me, it's very difficult to judge, say, what is his achievement in literature, and that is certainly also not the role of us as
I ask you just an opinion.
Organization, and that's why also we are, say, very careful in making any judgment at this point, because it would be very bad. And we had a similar debate, for instance, in 2008 related to the Olympic Games. If human rights are perceived as in China as something which is, say, a tool to prevent Chinese achievements being acknowledged. And that's why we, for instance, that was one of the reasons why we, for instance, have never advocated a boycott of the Olympic Games at that time. Of course, for us it was important, and we asked for human rights playing a role there. Because if you have relations with a country where there are strong human rights violations occur, then you are obliged to do something about it. And even more, just coming to the specific example of the Olympic Games, as the Chinese government was arguing that it helps to improve the human rights situation to have the Olympic Games there, that was for us more reason to say, okay, we have the Olympic Games there, but now let's also talk about human rights. And the same is now for the Nobel Prize for Literature. I mean, of course, that is also an opportunity, I mean, to raise the question, what is about those writers who are more critical about the Chinese government and who are victims of human rights violations because of that, because they are imprisoned, because what their literature is concerned of being considered as instigation to subversion. Just a political crime, which still can result in many years in prison. And of course, that is an opportunity to ask these kind of questions and then to again focus on the question of human rights by this kind of publicity. And that's what we see our role in, not to argue it's a bad idea that this man became a
symbol, in a way.
Well, of course, to some extent, he becomes a symbol also for Chinese literature and a lot of interesting things which were going on in Chinese literature in the past. And I think we should also acknowledge that. At the same time, it's a good opportunity, given that this is a prize with a very high reputation and a lot of public visibility, I mean, to also point out that there are many writers in China itself who cannot speak out or who did speak out and for this reason came to prison.
So shall you and your organization put those questions to the regime in China?
Of course, we do point these questions, and of course, we use these kind of opportunities. To again raise publicity for those victims of human rights violations. May it in this case be prosecuted writers. In other cases, it may be prosecuted human rights defenders.
Dr. Kaufmann, allow me to put another questions because I'm really seduced by the answers of our colleague. So I would be interested if you would take as a progress the cutting of a hand in spite of torture and killing of the Falun Gong members.
Well, I think it's one should not start in, say, making any comparison if it's about crucial treatment of people. It's very clear that both is say not acceptable,
unsuitable.
I think unacceptable. It's not a question of unsuitable in the sense of achieving a political goal. That torture is forbidden is something which is completely fundamental. And this is not something where you have some limit in a sense, okay, this is a situation where we have an exception and we might consider...
Cut a finger, not the hand, right? You cannot say that. Because that's a mafioso style approach.
Yeah, but that is that is again the question.
This is life, I'm afraid. This is life. You have to negotiate with this type of situations, and it's tough. And I admire you because you do.
I think this is not a point where one should negotiate. We had also discussions recently, for instance, in Germany about the question. Are there possibly limits to the right of being protected against torture in situations where a child had been abducted and police suspects that it may be able to save the life by torturing a person. Mm-hmm. And that's where we take a very fundamental position and say, no, torture is forbidden under any circumstance. And I think there are good reasons for that. And I think that are also result of lessons which we have learned in the past. Depending on the time, you might find many so-called good reasons why you could torture people. And
like in the USA, at the time of the Iraqi war, right?
Look at Guantanamo.
Right.
There, it's for the good sake of preventing terrorism. Going back in history here in Germany, there were also other regimes which believed that there were important reasons, to stabilize a regime, either during the Nazi time or afterwards in the GDR, which they considered as being good arguments in order to allow for torture or other kinds of cruel treatments. And I think that are the kind of lessons which we learned from history to say no. If it's about torture, and if it's about that there is a dignity of a human being which you cannot deny and which you cannot take away from a human being, then we have a very clear basis. And that's not something which we also, coming back to maybe the question of cultural diplomacy, and maybe which may sometimes have a bit of a risk of getting to the into the area of compromising because of cultural arguments. That's where we reach certain limits, and there we have to say, okay, no, here we are talking about universal human rights, which have to apply independently whether we talk about somebody from the Western states, whether we're talking somebody from the Arabic countries, or we're talking about somebody from China. Everybody.
So the spirit of Helsinki Declaration is still alive.
Certainly, in organizations like us, and I came to human rights work in, say, very early. I joined Amnesty when I was still at school. And it was really at that time when it was still the time when we had the East-West Cold War.
Yeah.
And I was really proud of
That's part of my life, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember.
I was really proud of saying, okay, I may not agree with all the statements which were made by this person who had been put to jail. But I do not agree of this person being put to jail just because he made use of his right of free expression. And he may have advocated communism in a Western country. He may have advocated democracy in an Eastern country.
Yeah.
Or at that time we even had also people we were arguing, okay, we should have an Islamic state. something I would not have agreed at that time also, but still I would have I did fight for his right to speak up.
He's very convincing, Dr. Kaufmann. I give you that.
So now we have two other guests in the round. First, I want to hand over the microphone to Mr. Wellink, who is part of the ICD in the master course, and I look forward to interesting questions.
Thank you very much for introducing me. I'm Koen Wellink, and I'm from the Netherlands, and the Dutch people actually spend quite a lot of money also to charity funds such as your organization. But my basic question is actually what is exactly, since we're talking about China, what is exactly the goals, or how the goals are achieved in China? And what are the challenges which lay ahead? And what kind of role plays cultural diplomacy in your policy in China?
Well, I mean, this is a difficult question as it covers a very broad range, and I should maybe also start to point out, I mean, if I'm talking here as a representative of Amnesty International, and if you're talking about human rights, so far our main expertise was in the area of political and civil rights. This is not because we believed political and civil rights to be more important, but just because we consider us as being just one organization, being part of a broader human rights movement, who would not be efficient if we would try to work to all human rights issues. I mean, we would be terribly bad in organizing any response to food crisis, which obviously is also a question of human rights. Now, and having said that, of course, our main objective is to try to achieve progress in a number of human rights questions in China. And one of the embarrassing things as far as China is concerned, I mean, we are talking about a country that has changed tremendously over the last decades, and there are no doubts about that. But at the same time, if I look, what are our concerns as far as political human rights are concerned, there are a number of things and issues which haven't changed so much, like persecution for political reasons, like being the possibilities in criminal law to persecute people for political reasons, the possibilities, I mean, to detain people on administrative detention. I mean, that are instruments which go back to the 50s, I mean, to the first Maoist campaigns, which are still in place as today. As far as torture concerns, as far as the death penalty concerned, we have little changes there. And so that's where we still have to fight. I mean, there had, of course, in detail, there have been changes. I mean, a situation in law.
Especially maybe in the question of Tibet, right? Mm-hmm. Religious repression of Buddhists.
Yes, I mean, that is a very good point which you made, in a sense that what obviously has changed are, for instance, the victims. I mean, the mechanisms, to some extent, are very similar as 30 years ago. But the way in how people have been affected, in particular, for instance, the ethnical minorities, I mean, not only Tibet, but also thinking about the situation of the Uyghurs, but also new groups which appeared. I mean, you briefly mentioned, for instance, Falun Gong as a new religious movement which is forbidden in China since 1999, and since then has been objected to numerous human rights violations. In particular, many people of this movement being imprisoned on administrative detention, basically a method to detain people where they have almost no rights because there is very little legal basis for that. And so what we are trying to do is to continue to call for the legal basis to be improved. And we are quite happy that there is, for instance, right now again restart of the debate in China on to abolish the re-education through labor, which is one of the main instruments for detaining people on an administrative basis for not just a few weeks but for years. The other thing which we try to promote, and that's actually a quite encouraging change in China, is that we have a growing number of people in China itself who are advocating human rights, who are campaigning for human rights. And so now we start to have new possibilities by trying to support these people who are campaigning in China itself. And that, of course, gives us, say, a new way of making impact, and also a new way of arguing with the Chinese leadership, because in former times they often try to argue, you are advocating Western rights. Now we can point out, no, we are fighting for those rights which in your country people are asking for. And this is a very important change. And as far as, say, cultural diplomacy is concerned, I considered a very important role of us, in particular also, when noticing in Germany that there's still quite a lot of prejudices about what is going on in China, to make clear that it's also from the perspective of a human rights organization, very important to have not a one-sided view on the country, but to look at different aspects. And their cultural plays an important role.
Has your question been answered?
Cultural diplomacy plays in so far a role that you look at internal sources like their culture, how do people think in China, not only a Western perspective, but also from the voice from the country. Yeah.
Exactly, that is something which is very important for us and which we really try to promote. To encourage Chinese people, to look back also in their own history. Looking, for instance, back into a very recent history of the Cultural Revolution, where it was the lack of protection of human rights which was also one of the reasons why this catastrophe, and there's where we agree, could happen. Unfortunately, we could not agree with Chinese leadership is, to think about the consequences, because that's where you still have, if you like, the political conflict, that the Chinese leadership is not yet ready to accept that there are principles which stand above the political leading party. That's the fundamental problem with the communist system. To find a way, how can one bring, say, a certain political system together with the concept of human rights, which says, okay, there are some rights which are simply fundamental, and any government cannot deny these rights.
So we have another person in the panel, which is another student of Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, also in the course on case studies, and maybe they're interesting. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Cade Russel, and I am from the United States. And I have a question. With the substantial growth of China's cultural diplomacy efforts around the world, with I think over 300 Confucius Institutes, can these institutes have a positive impact on human rights in China?
Well, in theory, these institutes could be, of course, a framework for having more exchange. So far, I'm afraid that this did not really happen, that these institutes rather have been an instrument of, the Chinese government's policy in order to try to have a more positive view on China. But I think it's probably not really a very clever strategy if you try to do it in a way by trying to cut away parts of Chinese culture which is not wanted from a political point of view. We have seen this year, this year of Chinese culture in Germany, and a large agenda which was mainly organized by the Chinese government, where these Confucius Institutes played a strong role. And there was basically no opportunity of also using this as an opportunity, to give also critical voices in China an opportunity, to speak up. And that makes it very questionable whether this is a good example of cultural diplomacy. I think not.